Under the lights of an elegant restaurant, an arrogant customer loses control and slaps Steven Seagal without knowing who he is messing with. But instead of responding with violence, Seagal leaves him paralyzed with a lesson the whole world will remember. Strength lies not in striking, but in mastering oneself. That night the aggressor will learn that calm can also destroy. It was 6:45 in the afternoon at the Iron Lotus, one of the most expensive restaurants in Los Angeles. The atmosphere was quiet and elegant. The soft clinking of cutlery, the low jazz playing in the background, the waiters moving like shadows. It was the kind of place where everyone spoke in hushed tones, afraid of shattering the illusion of class. At a table in the corner, Steven Seagal sat alone, dressed simply in a dark shirt and a leather jacket. I wasn't there to attract attention. He liked food, especially sushi. Calm, silent simplicity. That was his world. At the other end of the room, a loud voice broke the equilibrium. "Dude, this place is dead." Chadrillans thundered, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a navy blue suit. His friends, 3 other men with expensive watches and a cheap sense of humor, laughed hysterically at everything he said. They were the type who left little tip, but boasted of their wealth. Men whose confidence stemmed from never having been hit. A waiter approached their table with forced politeness. "Gentlemen, may I offer you something to get started?" "Yes," Chad said, leaning back in his chair. "Bring me a bourbon without ice and tell the chef I want my steak so rare he'll be calling for help." His friends burst out laughing. The waiter smiled weakly and walked away. Then Chad's gaze wandered around the room and stopped on Steven Seagal. At first it was simple curiosity, then recognition lit up her face. "Hey," he said, nudging his friend. "Is that the kind of thing you see in movies?" "The old man from Kung Fu, what's it called?" Seagal, one replied. "Yes, that's it. It looks smaller in person." Chad smiled arrogantly. "Smaller and older? What are you doing here? Shouldn't she be teaching yoga in Tibet or something?" Everyone laughed. The sound bounced off the walls of the restaurant. Seagal didn't react. He simply took a piece of sushi, gently dipped it in soy sauce and ate it. His stillness was his shield. That, of course, only emboldened them further. Chad pushed the chair back. "I'm going to say hello." "Don't do it, man," one of his friends said, grabbing his sleeve. "It's a legend. Legend. Bufo Chad. It's a finish." He crossed the room with a haughty stride, the drink wobbling in his hand. The talk stopped. The forks were left suspended in the air. Even the pianist hesitated, his fingers hovering over the keys. Chad arrived at Seagal's table and smiled as if he were meeting an old friend. "Hey, you're Steven Seagal, right?" Seagal slowly raised his gaze. "Yes." Chad held out his arms. "Man, I grew up watching your movies. Maximum Alert, Hard to Kill, all that old material." He adopted an exaggerated karate stance. "Jida." Some diners laughed nervously. Seagal's expression did not change. Chad leaned forward. "Are you still doing all that fake martial arts garbage?" A silence fell over the room. Seagal's voice was calm, almost soft. "You should go back to your table." "Oh, come on." "Don't get all sensitive," Char laughed. "I'm just asking. Do those old techniques still work in real life?" "They work," Seagal replied in a low voice, "but I try not to use them with children." Chad's friend's laughter died instantly. Chad's smile faltered. He took a step forward, towering over the seated man. "What did you say?" Seagal did not look up. "Did you hear me?" Something in that calm tone, in that unwavering composure, pierced Chad's fragile ego. He wasn't used to being ignored, especially not in front of an audience. Without warning, he slapped Steven Seagal in the face. The sound exploded in the restaurant like a gunshot. Everyone remained motionless. A fork fell onto a plate. A waiter stifled a scream. Seagal's head barely moved. The blow landed, but he didn't flinch. It only blinked once, slowly. The color drained from Chad's face. The satisfaction he expected, that small impulse of dominance, never came. All he saw was a stillness infinitely more dangerous than anger. Seagal's hand remained on the table. She wiped the corner of her mouth with a napkin, folded it carefully and set it aside. Then he stood up and the whole room seemed to shrink. Steven Seagal wasn't a giant, but when he stood up he filled the space as if gravity itself were following him. Her shoulders straightened, her posture became more assertive, and her presence became immense. The silence that followed was so thick you could chew on it. Chad took a step back without realizing it. Seagal looked at him not with anger, but with disappointment. "You shouldn't have done that." "And I was just joking," Chadbrada stammered. "Just a joke." "No," Seagal replied softly. "It wasn't." He took a slow step forward. Chad's heart was beating strongly. The diners could feel it. That change in the air when something unstoppable is about to move. Mr. Seagal, a waiter began, but Seagal raised a finger. The waiter stopped instantly. Chad raised his hands. Look, no hard feelings. Okay, Seagal moved. Nobody saw the first movement. 1 second he was still, and the next Chad's wrist was caught in midair when he tried to gesture. Seagal twisted it easily, redirecting the energy until Chad's own body betrayed him. His knees buckled, the air left his lungs, and in the blink of an eye he was face down on the ground with his arm immobilized behind him. It all lasted 2 seconds. Chad screamed not from pain but from surprise. All right, let me go." Seagal leaned down beside him and spoke so softly that only Chad could hear him. "Respect is like balance," he said. "Once you lose it, the ground always takes care of teaching you the rest." Then he let it go. Chad rolled to the side, holding his arm, staring at Seagal with wide, terrified eyes. The man he had called old hadn't even sweated. Seagal stood up, adjusting his jacket. "You should go back to your table." Chad stood up unsteadily, red with embarrassment. His friends avoided his gaze. All the diners watched him in silence with contempt. "I'm sorry," he muttered before hurrying off, knocking over a chair in the process. His friends followed him like rats abandoning a sinking ship. The restaurant remained silent for what felt like an eternity. Then someone started clapping softly at first, then louder. Soon the whole place was applauding. Seagal gave a slight bow. His expression remained impenetrable, and he sat back down, picking up his chopsticks as if nothing had happened. When the waiter finally approached again, trembling, he whispered, "Mr. Seagal Susuchi?" Seagal nodded calmly. "Thank you." He took another bite. Peace returned, but outside in the street, Chadrillans trembled not from anger but from something deeper. He knew what everyone in that restaurant had just learned. Steven Seagal didn't need to fight to win. If you don't want to miss our content, hit the like button and subscribe using the button below. Also, turn on notifications and tell us where you're listening from. Thank you for your support. The echo of the blow still lingered in the air. The conversations died out like a candle in the wind. The arrogant customer, a burly man in a gray suit, was breathing heavily, his face flushed with anger and pride. I couldn't believe what I had just done. He had slapped Steven Seagal without knowing who he was. The Aikido master did not respond immediately. His eyes, cold, patient, unfathomable, rested on the man with a calmness that froze the blood of everyone present. There was no hatred in her gaze, only a silent warning. A stillness so intense that it seemed to absorb all the noise in the restaurant. The arrogant customer tried to hold his gaze, but something inside him began to tremble. He didn't know why, but that silence was breaking him more than any blow. The waitress, still frozen with the tray in her hands, murmured in a trembling voice, "Lord, you don't know what the man has just done." He snorted. "And? He's just an old guy with a bun. You should thank me for giving you attention." The client's group of friends began to murmur, some trying to calm him down, others laughing nervously. Nobody understood what was happening, but everyone felt that something very bad was about to happen. Steven Seagal, without losing his composure, slowly got up from his chair. His movement was so controlled, so measured, that it seemed like a choreography studied for years. His black jacket slipped off his shoulders as if the air itself were parting to let him pass. The man instinctively took a step back. Seagal said nothing, he just watched, and that was enough to make the other man back away a little more. "You have an idea," Steven finally said in a deep, measured voice, "of what you just put at stake." The voice resonated deep, serene, without needing to rise. The entire restaurant fell into absolute silence. The arrogant customer tried to regain his pride. "I don't have to be afraid of anyone, much less a washed-up actor." The phrase landed like a dagger, but Steven Seagal barely raised an eyebrow. "Don't underestimate me, son," he replied in a calm, almost paternal tone. "There are men who only know how to raise their voices, and others who know when they don't need to." The customer laughed awkwardly, trying to hide his nervousness. "So what are you going to do? Hit me in front of everyone?" Steven Seagal looked at him for one more second and then slowly turned to the waitress. "Are you all right, miss?" he asked politely, completely ignoring the aggressor. She nodded with tears in her eyes, surprised that the man, after being humiliated, showed such calmness. That gesture changed something in the atmosphere. Some customers began to get up, murmuring among themselves. One of them recognized him. "My God, it's Steven Seagal, the former special operations agent," whispered a man at the back table. The news spread like wildfire. Cell phones were raised, cameras started recording, and the arrogant customer's face went pale. He was no longer facing a mere actor or some random old man. He was facing a man who had trained special forces, who had survived situations where a single mistake meant death. But Steven Seagal wasn't seeking revenge. He only wanted the other man to understand what he had truly done. Respect isn't demanded by shouting, he said gravely, taking a step closer. It's earned with silence, with control, with purpose. Don't deselect me, the customer yelled, shoving him clumsily. And then everything changed. In a fraction of a second, Steven Seagal moved. A fluid, elegant, almost imperceptible movement. A flick of the wrist, a slight shift of balance, and the arrogant customer ended up on his knees, his arm immobilized behind his back. The audience gasped. There was no violence, no fury, only absolute precision. Steven Seagal leaned forward slightly and whispered, "Never use your hands to humiliate. Use them to protect." The man, sweating and with his pride shattered, nodded, unable to speak. Silence once again enveloped the place like a sacred shroud. Seagal slowly released him, allowing him to stand. The customer, trembling, could barely stand. His gaze no longer held arrogance, only shame. "I'm sorry," he stammered, lowering his head. Steven Seagal placed a hand on his shoulder. Learning to apologize is the first step to being a man. The second is doing it differently next time. The man nodded, tears welling in his eyes. His ego had been broken, but for the first time in a long time he had learned something true. The waitress approached, her voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you, Mr. Seagal. No one else would have held back like that." He looked at her and smiled slightly. "Strength isn't in striking," he replied, "but in choosing when not to." As Steven Seagal straightened his jacket and left the restaurant, the customers began to applaud. It wasn't a showman's applause, but one of respect. The man who had caused all this remained. Staring at the ground, he knew that scene would haunt him for a long time, but he also knew that in that brief moment he had met someone who understood true discipline. Outside, the wind blew softly. Seagal walked to his car with the same composure with which he had entered. A journalist who had been eating at the restaurant ran after him. "Mr. Seagal, just one question. Why didn't you hit him back?" Steven stopped, turned his head slightly, and with a half-smile said, "Because the strongest blow isn't always delivered with fists." And without looking back, he got into his car and disappeared into the noise of the city. Behind him was a restaurant he would never forget that night. A lesson etched in everyone's mind. True power doesn't need to be demonstrated, it's felt. The sun was beginning to set over Los Angeles when the first notifications exploded on phones across the country. A video recorded inside a restaurant had gone viral. Man slaps Steven Seagal and receives a lesson without punches. In less than 6 hours, the clip reached 5 million views. The comments were filled with phrases like, "This is control, respect is earned like this. A true master doesn't need violence." Social media was abuzz. News outlets were vying for an interview, but Steven Seagal didn't answer any calls. While the world debated his reaction, he was far from the media frenzy, training alone in an old dojo on the outskirts of the city. The sound of his movements cut through the air with precision. Every breath, every step was meditation. For him, there was no virality, no fame, only balance. Beside him, a young student watched in silence. When Seagal finished his kata, the boy spoke respectfully. "Sensei, everyone's talking about you. They say what you did was incredible." Steven looked at him serenely. "Incredible," he repeated. "There's nothing incredible about choosing peace. What would be incredible is if that were the norm." The young man lowered his gaze. "I wouldn't have been able to control myself. If someone hits me, I react." Seagal approached slowly, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "That's what the world expects you to do, but strength isn't in reflex, it's in the decision." "The decision?" "Yes," Seagal replied. "The decision not to let anyone pull you out of your center. If they do, you've already lost, even if you win the fight." The boy nodded thoughtfully. Steven returned to the center of the tatami and knelt. For a moment he closed his eyes. The words of the man who had slapped him still echoed in his mind. He didn't hold a grudge. Deep down, he knew that scene had been necessary. Sometimes life uses humiliation to teach respect and calmness to demonstrate power. That night, while the world talked about him, Steven Seagal ate dinner in silence. No television on, no phone vibrating, only the crackling of the fire and the sound of rain on the window. But on the other side of town, someone couldn't sleep. It was the arrogant customer. Since the incident, his life had changed. He couldn't go out without being stared at. His name circulated in cruel comments. His face became a meme. However, what tormented him most wasn't the public humiliation, but the calmness of Steven Seagal. That serenity he had seen in his eyes weighed more heavily on him than any punishment. Every night he relived the moment, his raised hand, the blow, the silence that followed. And that silence haunted him as if inviting him to change. 3 days later, the man decided to do something he had never done before, seek forgiveness in person. He arrived at Steven's dojo with an uncertain gait, holding a folded letter. The place was almost empty. Only the sound of feet on the mat could be heard. When Steven saw him enter, he wasn't surprised. "I knew you'd come," he said calmly. The man swallowed nervously. "I don't know where to begin. I just want to apologize for what you did or for how you felt afterward," Steven asked gently. The man was silent. He lowered his head. "For both. I felt powerful, but it was just fear in disguise. I've always believed that yelling and humiliating others made me strong, but you broke me without a single blow." Steven nodded slowly. "I didn't break you," he said. "I showed you where you were broken. The rest is up to you. From you." The man placed the letter on a table. "Thank you for not destroying me when you had the chance." "It's not my style," Seagal replied with a slight smile. "The world already takes care of destroying us when we don't learn." The visitor bowed his head and left in silence. For the first time, he did so respectfully. That same week, Steven finally agreed to an interview. The journalist asked him, "Master, millions call you a hero for not responding with violence. What do you think about that?" Seagal took a deep breath before answering. "I'm not a hero. I'm just a man who learned that controlling your soul is harder than controlling your body. But people say you taught the world a lesson." "I didn't teach anything," he corrected. "Life puts us in situations where we have to choose who we want to be. I just chose not to become what I was facing." The journalist was silent, impressed by the clarity of his words. Seagal continued, "Many people confuse respect with fear, but true respect isn't imposed, it's inspired. It doesn't come from power, but from example." The interview became another viral phenomenon. Thousands of young people shared clips with phrases like, "Power lies in silence," or "You don't need to win to be right." Martial arts schools around the world showed the video to their students as an example of inner discipline. A month later, the man who had punched Steven reappeared online. He uploaded a short video. "I made a mistake that will shame me for the rest of my life, but that day taught me something. Respect isn't learned. Not in a fight, but in the humiliation it awakens in you. Thank you, Steven Seagal." That video also went viral, but for a different reason. It was real. He wasn't seeking fame. He was seeking redemption, and so, what began as an act of anger ended up being a lesson in humanity. The whole world saw how one man faced arrogance with wisdom and how another, humiliated, found the opportunity to change. One night, weeks later, Steven Seagal was walking along the coast. The sea was calm. The wind was blowing softly. Beside him, a young student asked, "Senny, do you think that man changed?" Seagal looked at the horizon and replied, "Perhaps, but that's no longer for me to say. The important thing isn't that the world changes for you, but that you don't change for the world." The young man nodded, and as the sun sank into the ocean, Steven closed his eyes with a faint smile, because he knew that once again he had won the most difficult battle, the one fought within oneself. The restaurant fell silent. Only the clinking of a spoon to the floor could be heard. The arrogant customer, his hand still trembling from the blow he had thrown, began to notice something strange. Steven Seagal didn't react as he expected. He didn't shout. He didn't defend himself. He didn't even look at him with hatred. He simply stood still, his eyes fixed on his teacup as if time had stopped. The customer's wife, visibly embarrassed, covered her face. Some employees stepped back. Others looked toward the door, waiting for someone to intervene, but no one moved. Everyone knew who Steven Seagal was, or at least they thought they did. An actor, a film legend, but few remembered that before the cameras he had been a law enforcement officer, a martial arts expert, and above all, a man who had learned to control his rage. The arrogant, confused man tried to maintain his defiant tone. "What's wrong, old man? Did you run out of courage?" he said with a strained smile, trying to impress those watching him. Steven slowly raised his gaze. His voice was so calm it froze the air. When a man hits another for no reason, he doesn't demonstrate strength, he demonstrates fear. His tone held not anger, but something far more unsettling: serenity. A serenity possessed only by men who know what they are capable of and choose not to do it. The client let out a forced laugh. "Fear, please, you're just an old-fashioned actor." Stephen sighed and stood slowly. His chair scraped on the floor. Despite his age, his posture was imposing. His presence filled the room. Each step he took toward the man seemed to weigh a ton. "Let me tell you something," Seagal murmured. "Men who seek respect through violence end up learning the hard way." "What does humility mean?" The customer stepped back slightly but tried to hide it. "And you're going to teach me?" he asked, laughing nervously. "No," Stephen replied calmly. "Life will take care of that, but if you insist, I can help you understand it faster." The man, blinded by pride, pushed Stephen once more. That was his mistake. In an almost imperceptible movement, Stephen twisted his body, took the aggressor's arm, and with a clean, fluid technique, deflected it to the ground. The blow wasn't violent. There was no blood or drama, only a brutal silence and the ragged breathing of the customer, who was now immobilized, unable to move. Stephen held him firmly, but without cruelty. "Listen," he said softly, so close that the arrogant man could feel his breath. "It's not about fighting, it's about understanding that not everything in life can be solved with shouting or blows. Sometimes the strongest man is the one who knows when to stop." He let go and took a step back. The humiliated customer got up with difficulty, looked around and noticed that everyone was watching him, not with admiration but with contempt. His pride crumbled. "I hadn't won anything." The wife approached Stephen. "Mr. Seagal, I'm very sorry. Not all men are like him." He nodded with a slight smile. "Sometimes people forget that respect is not demanded, it is earned." While the employees helped the man recover, a young waiter approached Stephen. "Sir, why didn't you defend yourself from the beginning?" Seagal looked at her still steaming cup. "Because anger is like a fire," he replied. "If you let it burn, it will consume you too. Self-control is the true art. Anyone can strike, few can forgive." The young man nodded silently, not knowing what else to say. Stephen sat down again. It seemed that the incident was over, but something else was about to happen. A man in a dark suit who was standing in the corner of the restaurant stood up. I had been observing everything. She approached slowly and bent down next to Stephen. "Mr. Seagal," he said in a firm voice, "I work for the police department. I don't know if you remember, but years ago you trained our intervention team." Stephen looked up in surprise. "Yes, I remember those days. Do you still use those breathing and disarming techniques?" "We use them every day," the officer replied respectfully. "And what I saw today was a lesson for all of us." He paused and added, "Sometimes an example is worth more than 1,000 orders." "Thank you for reminding us of that." The officer withdrew, but before leaving he turned to the customer, who was still regaining his composure. "Sir, if it weren't for his decision to control himself, he would be under arrest today or worse. I should be thanking you instead of insulting you." The customer lowered his gaze in embarrassment and murmured something barely audible. "I'm sorry." Stephen didn't reply, only nodded and returned to his tea. Outside it was beginning to rain. The drops pattered against the glass as the murmur of the restaurant slowly returned to normal. But a lesson lingered in the air. True power lies not in destruction, but in self-mastery. As the man's wife left, she stopped in front of Stephen once more. "Thank you," she whispered. "Perhaps today She learned something I'd been trying to teach her for years." Stephen looked at her with that unwavering calm that characterized him. "Don't worry, ma'am, we all learn, it's just that some need to fall first." She nodded, tears welling in her eyes, and left in the rain. When the place was quiet, the young waiter returned and said, "Mr. Seagal, may I ask you one last question?" "Of course. Have you ever lost control?" Stephen thought for a few seconds, then smiled slightly once, and that was enough for him to understand it wasn't worth it. The waiter nodded, taking a deep breath. He had witnessed more than just an altercation. He had seen that true strength doesn't need to shout, hit, or humiliate. That night, when he closed the restaurant, he couldn't stop thinking about the words of that silent man and understood something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Greatness isn't shown in the moment of anger, but in the peace you retain after being provoked. The rain continued to fall, hitting the restaurant windows as if trying to wash away what had happened. The customers began to leave one by one, but the atmosphere remained permeated with that silent tension, left only by events that leave a mark on people. Steven Seagal remained seated at the same table, calm, sipping the last of his tea. He didn't seem upset, didn't seem affected, simply present. It was as if everything that had happened had been part of a lesson written by life, and he had only been its instrument. The arrogant customer, Richard, stood in the doorway of the restaurant, watching the rain trickle from the ceiling and mingle with his thoughts. His eyes were red, not from anger, but from shame. His wife had already left. She hadn't even looked at him as she left. And for the first time in years, Richard didn't know how to justify himself. He looked at his trembling hands. He remembered the moment he had hit Steven. He felt the echo of his own stupidity. He took a deep breath, ran a hand over his face, and went back inside. The waiter saw him come in and tensed. "Sir, I think it's best if you leave," he said prudently. But Richard ignored him. He walked slowly toward the table where Steven was still sitting. Silence fell over the place again. The few remaining employees stopped what they were doing. The clock read 9:47 p.m. when Richard stopped in front of Seagal. "Sir," he began, his voice breaking. "There's no excuse for what I did." He looked up. He said nothing. "I don't know when I became this kind of person," Richard continued. "I've spent years yelling, being overbearing, believing that respect is the same as fear. And today, in front of everyone, you made me see who I really am. A coward." Steven gently placed his cup on the table. "You're not a coward," he said finally. "You're a confused man, and confused men can change if they have the courage to look in the mirror." Richard lowered his head. "My wife left me a few minutes ago. She said she was tired of living with someone who only knows how to yell." He laughed humorlessly. "And she's right. Maybe I deserve to be alone." Steven watched him for a few seconds, then stood up and placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "You don't deserve to be alone. But you do deserve to understand why you're losing the people you love. Sometimes life humbles us not to destroy us, but to wake us up." Richard nodded slowly. The words stung, but they also set him free. "How do you do it?" he asked. "How do you stay so calm after of something like that?" Steven looked at him with a mixture of compassion and firmness. "I've seen what anger can do," he said. "In war, in the streets, in families. Rage doesn't just destroy the one who receives it, it poisons the one who feels it. And one day, if you don't stop it, it consumes you until you're empty." Richard took a deep breath. "I'd like to learn that, to learn not to react." Steven smiled slightly. "Then start by listening more and speaking less. Learn to observe. Silence teaches you what words cannot." There was a moment of stillness. Then Steven picked up his coat and prepared to leave. But before crossing the threshold, he stopped and looked at Richard one last time. "Don't seek to be feared, seek to be respected. And remember this," he paused. "Respect begins when you learn to respect yourself." With that, he left in the rain. Richard stood motionless, watching the man walk away in the downpour, with the calm of someone who has nothing to prove. For the first time, he felt genuine admiration, not for a famous actor, but by a human being who mastered something he had never understood. Inner peace. 2 days later, the restaurant opened as usual. Rumors of the incident had spread throughout the city. Some told it as an anecdote, others as a legend. But for those who were present, it was something more. A reminder of what it means to be truly strong. The young waiter, inspired by that encounter, had discreetly placed a small handwritten note on the wall. It read, "Power is not measured by the force of the blow, but by the calm you maintain after receiving it." That phrase, signed with the initials SS, became a symbol of the place. One afternoon, Richard returned. He was dressed differently, not in his expensive suit, but in simple clothes without the tie that suffocated him every day. He carried a bouquet of flowers. The same waiter recognized him. "You're back, sir?" he asked in surprise. "Yes, I want to apologize to everyone who saw my worst side." The young man nodded. There was something different in his gaze, something calmer. Richard approached the table where Steven usually sat. She sat down. She placed the flowers on her. "For the man who taught me more with a look than I did in years of arrogance," she said softly. He sat down for a moment and looked at the tumiante that an employee had placed in front of him. He closed his eyes and murmured to himself, "I promise not to react again. I promise to listen before I raise my voice." Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Steven was walking through a park with his hands inside his black coat, enjoying the silence. A child playing with a ball tripped near him. "Are you okay, little one?" Seagal asked, helping him to his feet. Yes, sir, the boy replied. My dad says that if you fall, you have to get up without crying. Stephen smiled. Your dad is right, but it's okay to cry too, as long as you don't get stranded. The boy smiled and ran back to his game. Stephen watched him walk away and thought about Richard at the restaurant that night in the rain. He whispered to himself. Every fall has a purpose, if you know how to learn from it. The wind blew through the trees and a feeling of peace enveloped him. He had not triumphed over another man. Something more powerful had won, the impulse of anger, the desire to dominate. As the sun began to set, her silhouette was lost in the golden light of the sunset, and somewhere a repentant man began his own path to redemption, remembering the words of that stranger who changed his life. Not all heroes raise their voices. Some teach in silence, and their lesson lasts forever. 6 months had passed since that night in the restaurant. The story of the man who slapped Steven Seagal had gone viral. The video, recorded by one of the customers, went viral on social media in a matter of days. Millions saw it, millions commented on it. Some mocked the aggressor, others criticized him, but most were impressed by the teacher's calmness. The world knew the public version, but no one knew what had happened after the cameras were turned off and silence returned. Richard Coleman, the man who had lost control, had changed. She had left her job at the investment firm, where shouting was the norm and respect was mistaken for fear. Now I was working on something very different. He taught self-defense to at-risk youth in a small community gym. Every time she crossed the threshold, she saw in the mirror the reflection of a man who was not the same. His look had changed. It was no longer defiant or empty, it was more serene, although it still carried the weight of regret. That afternoon, while he was organizing the gloves and mats, one of the teenagers in the group approached him. Mr. Richard, is it true that you met Steven Seagal? The man smiled, lowering his head. Yes, I knew him, he replied humbly. They say you slapped him, the boy said with a mischievous laugh. Richard sighed. Yes, and it was the worst mistake of my life. The boy looked at him confused. And he didn't hit you back? No, Richard replied. That's what he taught me the most. What thing? True strength isn't shown by reacting, but by mastering what you feel inside. The young man watched him silently, trying to understand. Richard smiled slightly and patted him on the shoulder. Go on, put on your gloves. Today you're going to learn that a fist is only useful if you know when not to use it. That night, as he was closing the gym, Richard stopped to look at the sign at the entrance. It read discipline, control, respect. 3 words he had borrowed from Steven Seagal's teaching. Every day he repeated them mentally like a mantra. Suddenly a familiar voice pulled him from his thoughts. Good motto. Richard turned around and his heart skipped a beat. There was Steven Seagal standing in the dim light of the sign wearing his classic black coat and with his usual calm demeanor. Mr. Seagal, Richard stammered, incredulous. What are you doing here? Steven took a few steps toward him, smiling slightly. I heard you were teaching discipline to the kids in the neighborhood. I thought it would be good to stop by and see how you do it. Richard swallowed. I don't know if I'm worthy of that. We all are, Steven replied, if we learn not to repeat our mistakes. They entered the gym. Silence enveloped them, broken only by the faint echo of raindrops falling on the metal roof. Steven looked around carefully. It wasn't big, but it had spirit. Photos of the guys on the walls, inspirational quotes, and one with his own name on it. Calm is a man's most dangerous weapon. Steven smiled at the sight. I didn't know you'd made me a date. Richard laughed nervously. I didn't know how to thank him. You changed my life without hitting me. I didn't do anything, Seagal replied. Life put you in front of yourself. I was just there when you opened your eyes. They were silent for a moment. Then Richard, in a firmer voice, said to him, You know, for months I couldn't look at myself in the mirror, but I understood that the biggest mistake wasn't hitting it. It was not knowing myself. Steven nodded. That's something most people never learn. We are not what we do in a bad moment, but what we decide to do afterwards. Suddenly, one of the young men opened the gym door. Upon seeing Steven, she froze, mouth agape. Are you the one in the video? He asked, amazed. Steven let out a soft laugh. It depends on which video you watched, kid. The young man smiled excitedly and ran to call his friends. Within seconds, the place was filled with kids with phones asking for photos and autographs. Steven patiently agreed to each one, but then raised his hand to ask for silence. Listen, he said in a calm voice. I don't want people to remember that video because of the slap or the fame. I want you to remember what came next. She turned to Richard. This man learned to transform his pride into purpose, and that is what truly matters. The young people applauded. Richard lowered his head, moved. For a moment, all that had been pain turned into respect. Not towards Stephen, nor towards the past, but towards the lesson they were both leaving there. When the night was over, Stephen said goodbye with a firm handshake. "You've done something good here, Richard." "Don't stop him." "I won't," he replied honestly. "And if I ever forget who I am again, I will remember that night." Stephen looked him in the eyes. "That night was not a humiliation, it was your rebirth." As he left, Stephen disappeared among the streetlights. Richard watched him leave, knowing that he would probably never see him again, but also understanding that he no longer needed him. The teacher had fulfilled his purpose to sow calm where there had once been pride. He closed the gym, watched the lights go out, and thought, sometimes a mistake can destroy you or it can awaken you. It all depends on what you choose next. In the shop window, the reflection of her face no longer showed shame, but peace. He had found redemption, not through violence, but through self-control, and so the man who once slapped Stephen Seagal became someone who learned to live with open hands. Not to hit, but to guide.